My name is Liz Brady, and I'm a senior here at Hillsdale from Syracuse, New York, studying economics. It's a pleasure to welcome our speaker this afternoon. Jordan Schachtel is an investigative journalist and publisher of the dossier on Substack. He earned a BA from Monmouth University and an MA in International Affairs from the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C. He previously served as a national security correspondent for Breitbart News and an investigative journalist for The Blaze. A frequent guest on radio shows, podcasts, and television shows, including on Fox News, One America News Network, and Newsmax. He has written for numerous publications, including The Wall Street Journal, Real Clear Politics, USA Today, The Epoch Times, The Federalist, and The New York Times. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Schachtel.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me. Let me just set this up. Wow, very cool facility. Amazing auditorium. I like how they have the students in the back and like the cool kids section up top. It's a good look. But before I get started, I wanted to thank Hillsdale College, especially the administrators and the staff, for their incredible courage to defy the popular consensus over the last couple of years. I don't know if the students realize how lucky they were to have this opportunity to learn in person and to not be subject to this pharmaceutical regime that basically, the college population of the rest of the entire nation was subject to. Hillsdale is so unique in the fact that they defied this big pharma, big government, public health expert consensus. And they didn't ask me to do a pitch, but your money is well spent here. It would have been so much easier for them just to succumb to the demands of the Michigan governor, two administrations, one Republican, one Democrat, and it speaks volumes that you chartered an independent course, and it speaks to the mission of Hillsdale College and that it's working to create independent, interesting thinkers and successful people in the United States. And I was doing some research on Hillsdale. I spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. the last 7-8 years before I moved to Florida, and I knew about Hillsdale College, but I was shocked by how difficult it is now to get into Hillsdale. I mean, if you guys were a stock on the NASDAQ, you'd be like one of those blue chip with a lot of room to run. And I think Hillsdale is going to become like basically the Harvard, Yale, whatever you want to call it, of the Midwest on the trajectory is in. So the students here, you're in amazing shape right now. So how did I find myself basically spending the last few years diving down this COVID hysteria rabbit hole? And as a journalist, I think one of the most important qualities is you have to be able to challenge conventional narratives. And what we found was that wasn't really happening at all. And for me, this journey from being basically labeled a bioterrorist after anything I said. I mean, I'm sure RFK Jr. has a similar experience, and the cancel campaigns against him. But I feel like the momentum is turning in the right direction finally. And we can start by talking about Big Pharma and these mRNA shots. This tale of power grabs, corruption, deceit, and of course it begins in Wuhan in January 2020. The Chinese government uploads this gene sequence to a database. Suddenly, Pfizer and Moderna are right there. They win this vaccine jackpot. No one's really asking any questions. Was it because they had a superior product, or rather, were they just having the pieces in place to work the system to their benefit? What's interesting about this is that before the COVID era, Moderna had never brought a product to market before, not a single product. And this is amazing to me. When I researched this, I thought like maybe it was just fake news or something, but it is true. And I was pointing this out, and they're like, they just kind of like figured it out. And if you read these stories about Moderna in these publications, in these science publications, it was all about their human trial, not even getting to human trials. Like the rats were dying when they injected them with this stuff. And suddenly, January 2020 comes around and Moderna has it figured out. It's good to go. But it wasn't just a Moderna thing. It was also a Pfizer thing. Their partner, BioNTech, had also never brought a single product to market. But they were backed by very influential individuals who were terrific at doing marketing campaigns and spinning the narrative. And this is where we have this fusion of big government and big pharma. Call it what you want. You call it the uniparty, the ruling class, the Washington, D.C. establishment. In recent decades and years and months and days, we continue to see this fusion of big pharma and big government. Corporatism and statism. It's resulted in this incredibly weird scenario we find ourselves today, where I think, of course, the coming graduates of Hillsdale who I just met are going to have to make a difficult decision, whether you want to become part of that system or try to do something on your own. And there's positives and negatives to each part of that. But I think that, as proven by me being on this stage, after 99% of the folks who hated my opinions in January and through December of 2020 now are very much on my side, I think. You have this kind of like Newton's third law effect where you have this equal and opposite reaction. And I hope to bring the best out of that. But I want to get back to this Pfizer-Moderna thing because I think that it's still not really clear what exactly happened and the power grab and the money grab. And it was just so, I don't think that we really were able to focus on it because, there was all this hysteria happening. People were getting sick and there was just way too much on people's minds, but pharmaceutical companies were getting very rich. Pfizer had the federal government siphon off $100 billion from the American taxpayer last year in revenue. And 31 billion of that was profit. And what's even more shocking is that all of Pfizer's profit comes from these pharmaceutical products that are supposedly free and that they mandated upon the population. That if it wasn't for the COVID era, these companies would not be making any money. They would not be able to buy other companies, be able to invest in other R&D platforms that will help them succeed in the future. I mean, this was such a coup for these two companies. And I want to just give you a perfect example of the hypocrisy. So there's a 2020 interview with Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, who happens to be a horse doctor, by the way. I don't know if many people know that. He's an equestrian veterinarian. So the Times interviewer asks him, what about pricing? And he goes, the vaccine should be free to all people. And he kind of he's a clever salesman because what does that mean? So the guy goes, are you giving it away for free? And he goes, no. We're gonna give it to governments, but we're gonna charge the government. So he goes, a very nominal value, but our intent is to ask governments that they should, for these prices, they should provide it free of charge for all citizens. So they're just going to rob the taxpayer blind, but deliver it free of charge. And then the interviewer says, so are you essentially selling it to governments at cost? And he goes, no, I think we'll make a profit, but a marginal profit. And now we just see Pfizer's filings last month that they made $100 billion in revenue last year, almost half of that being profit. And of course, the profit comes from you, the American taxpayer, and it's only made possible through the big pharma, big government nexus. I've reported on Pfizer's tax filings since the beginning of this era, and every single time, they're banking tens of billions of dollars per quarter, and people are just they saved the world, so it's fine. But I think as this quote-unquote emergency winds down, you can expect Pfizer to pivot elsewhere. I think that they've already kind of started on that path. They're now introducing RSV vaccines for pregnant women. So they're getting into all kinds of things. Moderna wants you to take a shot now that you inject directly into your heart. So they're very ambitious. And I think like there's a real disconnect between what the corporate press is telling them and these government partners are telling them and how the people really feel about them. And I think you saw this at the World Economic Forum in Davos earlier this year, where you had a lot of good reporters, like from Rebel News and elsewhere, that were kind of like really laying into them. And the CEO of Pfizer was pretty shocked and like unable to answer these questions. So I think that the tide is definitely turning. And if we want to talk about Moderna, it's really the same thing. You know, they didn't make as much money, but they have an incredible, since their founding in 2010, they've been interlinked with the federal government in ways that still kind of remain unexplained. You know, their IPO, they were talking about curing cancer and other types of disease. They weren't talking about making vaccines for coronaviruses, but people really seem to have not held them accountable. And you have this weird thing in the pharmaceutical industry that I'm sure RFK Jr. talked about last night, where you have these repurposed drugs, like an Ebola drug all of a sudden becomes a coronavirus drug, and none of it really makes any scientific sense when you look into it, but then they just start marketing it that way, and it's all good. You know, they just start selling it. By 2012, Moderna was a biotech unicorn, raised $1 billion on the promise of the mRNA platform. DARPA got involved, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. They gave hundreds of millions of dollars. Fauci's National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases also. They have confidential agreements, they got patents, they got royalty deals. The US government has joint ownership of the Moderna vaccine. And then there's something that we can talk about more broadly in a second, but we also have like this public-private network fusion, which I think is best exemplified by Bill Gates and the Gates Network. And the Gates Network's basically like its own quasi-government entity. And his people have been allowed to have massive pre-IPO equity investments in Moderna, BioNTech, which again, partnered with Pfizer to make the shots. And as we have seen in the coming months and years after that, this man and his institutions have used their influence to get their products and their services in front of the government. And I'm sure there are some other companies, and what I'll touch upon in a second is like, why did we only have such few options? Why was it only Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, and Novavax, which was way too late, and they're basically bankrupt. If you look at their shares, they're down 90% and considering pulling the plug in the whole company. So this gold rush effect was so important for these companies. Johnson & Johnson, if you recall, they were the third company to receive clearance for their shot. It wasn't mRNA. But what was interesting was that there was a giant corporate press campaign against Johnson & Johnson about specifically the safety and efficacy of their shots. Supposedly, like, they were the only one that was having the problems, not anyone else. And it successfully, like, this was like akin to a ruthless cartel battle, and Johnson & Johnson lost, and they kind of like retreated back into the other space because Johnson & Johnson, like Pfizer, they have other products. You know, for Moderna, it's all or nothing. For Pfizer's bottom line, it's very much all or nothing. For Johnson & Johnson, they can go back to selling whatever they want to sell. So they retreated. There was a vicious media campaign labeled, they said that people were developing, you know, deep vein thrombosis, other blood clotting disorders, heart disorders, but it was only Johnson & Johnson. So my academic background's in international affairs and foreign policy. So this, why only 4 companies in the United States making these shots is very interesting to me, especially when you look at what was happening around the world. And I know better to believe that the nations of the world, especially fierce adversaries, Russia, China, US, somehow found like a kumbaya moment and we all got together. The institutional narrative is that we found a cure to the coronavirus because there was this global effort to bring everyone together and succeed for the good of humanity. But if you look at what happened with these vaccine platforms, that's not at all what happened. I think what we've really been witnessing is a series of state-backed big pharma, kind of like cartel fights, geopolitical information operations that they're running against each other. In the United States, it was very successful. We said mRNA is the best thing, and then everyone kind of believed that mRNA is the best thing. But that's not what they say in China. That's not what they say in Russia. And if you look at the data, there's no clear real winner. In my non-scientific opinion, I think that it's all trash. So basically, in the United States, select pharmaceutical companies were able to seal off the market. But in some countries, governments decided not to go this route. For instance, in Mexico, they have access to 10 different brands of shots. In Hungary, they have 15. In other places like Iran, Turkey, Cuba, and elsewhere, they made their own thing that they put in their citizens' arms. They have their state, there's no separation between big pharma and big government. They just tell the government scientists, hey, make something and write a paper that says it's 90% effective and have people take it, and then you're cured, you move on. China and India, you have over 1 billion people in the world there, and they didn't adopt mRNA technology. Is it because everyone in China and India is stupid? I'm very doubtful that that's the situation there. China's now potentially rolling out mRNA applications, but it seems more as just like a marketing campaign. And Russia, the world's 10th most populated country, they also have their own thing that they call Sputnik, which is a viral vector shot. So billions and billions of people have had a variety of different options. According to the World Health Organization, I think there's over 50 approved COVID vaccines. And it's amazing the level of propaganda globally that we've been subject to, that we just need to kind of accept that all of this stuff has 80% efficacy, 92% efficacy, and this is the paper that, it's very interesting to me. And a fascinating study should happen in the continent of Africa because hardly anyone has ever taken these shots. And Africa wasn't annihilated. I mean, remember in Wuhan, we saw photos in January 2020 of people in business suits just falling on their face and supposedly dropping dead, and that situation hasn't really been solved. So there's just been all this weird propaganda, and the supposed advantage of mRNA is nowhere to be found. And it's very difficult to compare countries, but mRNA should have stood out to at least a noticeable degree. We should have had some kind of chart that you could point to that says, oh, we had the better shot, but that's not really happened. There's no discernible difference statistically between countries with a population that is widely accepted COVID shots and nations where citizens have skipped the injection protocol entirely. Russia had Sputnik, China had Sinovac, and they exported it broadly to their partners. These vaccines have become, in my view, nothing more than an extension of the power projection of the state that creates them. And it completely conforms with global alliance structures. So, for example, if you see a very pro-China country, there's no way that they're going to let Pfizer in, which is interesting because these countries, I get that nobody gets the government they deserve, but this is supposed to be about everyone's health, and it doesn't seem to be that way. China's partners are using Chinese products. Americans' partners are using Pfizer and Moderna. In Europe, they were using some other stuff in Oxford, but also Pfizer and Moderna. Russia's friends are using Russian shots. Many created their own shots, Iran, Turkey, Cuba. So how are we getting indoctrinated with all this bad information? And I think it's important to, especially because we're at an academic university, we need to sometimes roll ourselves back to the first principles of the situation. And there's this term we've been inundated with since the beginning of this era of hysteria, and that has been public health expert. And the government and Big Pharma love to refer us to public health experts. So I've done some research on this topic, and if you Google or DuckDuckGo or Bing or whatever search engine you're using, you Google what is a public health expert, and nobody really knows. It's very interesting. If you run an internet search, you get 40 different answers from 40 different academic departments. Answers range from professionals in the field struggle to define public health precisely to the art of preventing disease. And these people are supposedly experts at something that can't even be defined. It really, it's fascinating to me that since the beginning of the COVID era, this big pharma, big government coalition has demanded we listen to these experts. These people, it's basically like, the Halloween horror show. When you have Fauci, you have Admiral Levine, you have a fake doctor who leads the World Health Organization named Tedros, who's like a puppet for the CCP and Bill Gates. Supposed public health expert groups include the CDC, WHO, Gates Foundation, all severely corrupted institutions with specific narratives that they want to peddle, with bad incentives. But these are the experts. That was the tagline forever, was listen to the experts. But what exactly are these people good at? It remains undecided. They told us that these lockdowns were the key. When that didn't work, they said masks, everyone just wear them. Curfews, physical distancing, mRNA shots. And they had it all figured out. They spoke with incredible confidence. Most of these people were academics or epidemiologists, which is a whole other thing that is basically just like, in my view, it's like a profession for people that like to do math but don't want to become a mathematician, and there's some kind of like nexus in health there. So how could these highly touted experts get everything so catastrophically wrong? And I think that in America, there's a guy named Anthony Fauci, who you may have heard of, and he has a lot to do with this, the fusion of big government and big pharma. And I'm sure RFK Jr., who spoke last night, completely unloaded on this guy, so I'll keep it brief. But since 1984, when Fauci became a big pharma kingmaker through assuming the office of the NIAID, on an annual basis, he moved around billions of dollars. He used political maneuvering through his bureaucrat status. So Fauci was very smart not to become a political appointee, because then he was subject to being fired. He was a civil servant, which made it so that he was basically in charge without having the official title of being in charge of the whole NIH. And everyone knew that in order to get grant funding, you had to go through Fauci. So this totally corrupted the institution. For almost 40 years, any private or public health drug enterprise that received government funding had to maintain good standing with Fauci. You could cure cancer, but if Fauci didn't like you, he could just say no. So there's a huge problem there. Fauci had I think where I disagree with some people is that some folks just say, Fauci wanted to get rich, he's the highest paid bureaucrat, which is all true, but I think for Fauci it was about power. Having spent 7-8 years in Washington, D.C., for these people it's mostly about power. Yes, they do go eventually to cash out at the likes of BlackRock, or they have a nice chair at Harvard or something, but while they're in D.C., they like to accumulate power and influence. And the reason why Fauci stayed around for so long, I think they said he was worth about $12.5 million when he supposedly left government, even though he's kind of like on salary there, which is a whole separate issue. But Fauci could have been way more wealthy than he was when he left government. I think when you have the power to make or break massive corporations and industries, that was the true appeal of Fauci's gig, and that's why he loved it. And you can see that in his emails with the likes of Hillary Clinton and all these bigwigs in Washington, that he loved just being able to call them friends and being able to influence people. And sure, he bagged untold millions of dollars through royalties, investments, and his record-breaking salary, but yeah, I don't think he was in it for the money. He could influence whether products were going to make it. He could sabotage production lines. And lots of individuals and corporations owe this man their livelihood. And everyone knew that Fauci was the kingmaker. So it was more important to get on Fauci's good side than it was to create a good product. And what's interesting is that, according to some recent reporting, Fauci hasn't actually even left the government. He's in this good old boys club at the NIH, which is basically that you retire, but you remain on salary, and he has a full-time security detail that's billed at over $1 million a month. And he's had that security detail since 2020. So he's incurred tens of millions of dollars in taxpayer expenses. DC, it's like royalty out there, and Fauci believes himself to be, he needs the US Marshals to go around with him when he's at these red carpet award dinners because it's really necessary. For example, it's not just Fauci, it's the entire NIH. This is what they do to reward the bureaucrats who have spent their lifetime there. There's an 85-year-old former chief of viral diseases, Dr. Bernard Moss. He's still taking a paycheck. Dr. John Bennett, who's another high-ranking NIAID official, he's 90 years old. He's still taking a paycheck, and they don't actually do anything. It's like all these no-show jobs. I suppose you could make an argument that you'd rather them have them doing nothing than sabotaging our lives, but. And speaking of menaces to society, how could we talk about Big Pharma and big government without talking about Bill Gates? Because he really brings those two things together. I think there's no more successful force in bridging the gap between Big Pharma and big government than Mr. Gates. Through what he describes as public-private cooperation, somehow this software guy, who also happens to believe that there's too many people in the world, so I don't think that he'd be a great healthcare ambassador for anyone who's actually seriously concerned about their well-being. He's the most influential public health expert other than Fauci. It's him and Fauci. If you were doing like an NCAA tournament bracket, they're both 1 seeds for sure. Bill Gates was so enormously influential in the early days. If you recall, during the early days of the coronavirus task force, everyone was saying, listen to the models. They were drawing models about how to respond to a coronavirus, and you had these supposed experts at these academic institutions that would draw some chart straight up and say, if we don't do this, everyone's going to die in 3 months. And it's like, that's what the model says. And one of the premier modeling institutions is called the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, which is funded entirely by Bill Gates. And Deborah Birx, the former COVID task force manager, or whatever her role was, she would meet with these Gates people, and then the Gates people would tell her, this is what's going to happen if you don't shut it down or mask. And then basically she would demand that they do this, and the state governors would follow suit. Of course, in Florida, those of us who live there, we were lucky enough to have Ron DeSantis, who kind of balked at the trend within basically 2 weeks. So as a Floridian now, I'm so much appreciative that there were some that defied the consensus. But there was a huge problem with Gates' world, telling everyone that the world was going to end if they didn't listen to their models. And Gates was smart about it because he controlled these institutions, but he didn't shove it in anyone's faces. So he was really operating behind the scenes. And Gates does this very well. He's made tremendous inroads through what he calls public-private partnerships again with these government health institutions. And basically this is Gates, he regularly participates or has his employees direct policy meetings, which are convened by entities within the National Institutes of Health. And Gates, he has them, he's compromised a lot of these NIH committee members who are either directly or were former Gates Foundation employees, and they vote on resource allocation, NIH regulations, policy, and what Gates says basically is that he provides, his people provide, or Gates directly or his people provide a roadmap for how he wants resource allocation to look, and they know that if they defy him, no money is going to come. So he creates this corrupting system where he brings these government bureaucrats into the fold, sets up this $10, $20 million project, and then basically threatens to rug pull them if they go another route. But Gates has seemingly moved on to the next crisis already. If those of you who are aware, he recently soured very much on these mRNA shots. He's sold 90% of his holdings in BioNTech, according to recent filings with the SEC. And suddenly, he's been taking his private jet around the world everywhere while saying that carbon emissions are the biggest problem, and sold 90% of his stake. And then suddenly he said, basically that these shots aren't so good. Maybe we need some new research and whatnot. It didn't really work out as advertised, and that's really the end. So now Bill is talking about the Earth is dying, and we need to save ourselves by destroying humanity. So that's his new project. Blocking out the sun, forcing Africans to eat only corn instead of industrialize. I think Bill Gates is an awful guy, and I think it's. And yeah, he's just moved on. I think that there will be accountability for the elites, but the hubris is just shocking to me, where you had billions of these shots injected into people's arms, and suddenly, the narrative changes, and then it's like, oh, too bad, we're moving on to the next crisis. So in Washington, D.C., you have this revolving door that a lot of you have heard of. Basically, if you have an experimental drug that needs rapid authorization from the FDA in order to be sold to the masses, or you're looking to siphon billions of dollars from the taxpayer, today you can basically buy yourself a former or current government health commissioner and use this public sector, private sector revolving door system, which President Trump, to his credit, tried to stop really unsuccessfully. Hopefully, if he gets a term 2, he'll take another shot at it. But we can take a look at the most blatant examples of this revolving door with Big Pharma and Big Government. I'm sure everyone's aware of Scott Gottlieb. He's on the Pfizer board. He's the ultimate personification of the revolving door as a Wall Street Journal column, CNBC, complete panic monger, compensated very well to sell panic, to sell shots, earned millions. He's on a million different boards. People hire Scott Gottlieb because they need their shot to get regulatory approval. He's the former FDA commissioner, and he makes it happen behind the scenes. Today, you have the current director of drug evaluation for the FDA. Her name is Patrizia Cavazzoni. She is an academic psychiatrist by background, but she also worked for Pfizer. So before entering her government role, she was in Pfizer, Eli Lilly, and now she's clearing drugs for the FDA as a psychiatrist. So unfortunately, again, the Trump administration tried to stop the revolving door, but I think the executive order wasn't sticky enough. We had Stephen Hahn, he now works for a Moderna associated company, but he was very much involved in Operation Warp Speed, former FDA commissioner during the time. He was the guy that basically gave clearance to Pfizer and Moderna's shot. But this isn't a new problem. We can go all the way back to the Bush years, Mark McClellan was the FDA commissioner from 2002 to 2004, and he sits on the board of Johnson & Johnson. So it's very much a systemic issue that continues to bother us. And basically, sadly, everyone involved with Operation Warp Speed, not everyone, but so many people who were labeled as healthcare experts, almost immediately upon leaving the administration, they joined pharmaceutical boards. Jerome Adams, former Surgeon General, you'll find him on social media demanding that everyone take 6 boosters, wear 3 masks. He's a true believer. After leaving his post, he immediately joined several pharmaceutical boards. Dr. Birx, same thing. Dr. Robert Redfield, former CDC director. They all cashed out, and they're all involved in COVID-related industries, or they're COVID-related treatments, injections, drugs. I mean, there's just no shame in DC, and it's very clear. So what I can leave you with is right now in Congress, there's a lot of rumblings about, we're going to hold China accountable for the lab leak. And it's interesting to me that the narrative's changing a lot in DC, but I don't really buy into that they genuinely want to pursue the truth about what happened. The people in charge right now are torn between two premises. Was COVID the result of a lab leak event or a naturally evolving virus? And you can't really talk about anything else. So that's where the conversation is happening. And I think it's the wrong conversation to have. And both the US government and the Chinese government don't want you to discuss really the origin story for the panic itself because it involves Big Pharma and the government. And perhaps they help to manifest that panic. There's these stories now in the Telegraph in the UK that have been coming out in recent days where the British government is very clearly trying to drive people into taking COVID tests and trying to drive policy based on fear alone. And it's been pretty shocking to me. But regardless of what you believe, it's pretty remarkable that we know basically nothing about the real origin stories of COVID. And I can leave you with some questions and avenues of inquiry to pursue. For instance, it would be nice to know who was patient 0 in Wuhan. We haven't really ever figured that out. Or was patient 0 in Wuhan or somewhere else? Why isn't Fauci and the gang interested in this question? It would also be nice to know the process through which the Chinese government uploaded the COVID gene sequence to the internet, resulting in software that would produce the Pfizer and Moderna shots. Again, there's studies that these first cases may be unrelated to Wuhan, so all of these governments' timelines and pharmaceutical companies' timelines are off by maybe months or years. What was with all those weird video productions coming out of China? When we talk about big pharma and big government, this is really a global issue. Pfizer and Moderna, according to their own information, were reportedly working on mRNA COVID vaccines almost immediately after the first reported case in Wuhan, before anyone even got really sick from it. And this is according to their own company timelines. And the once claimed miracle cure became enormously profitable. So I hope that the people in Congress, and I think if we want to hold these people truly accountable, I hope that we see people like Bill Gates, Bourla, the CEO of Moderna, Fauci, and the like to be held accountable. But until then, I think the swamp will just continue to move forward to the next crisis. But if we hold them accountable for this crisis, things may actually change. So I would just urge you to get in contact. It could even be like, in Florida, we have DeSantis impaneled the Supreme Court of Florida to investigate pharmaceutical fraud in Big Pharma. And I think that you can prosecute this case through several angles, but if we just kind of like accept this institutional narrative and we're all supposed to be mad at China now, but not at our own government, I think that we'll drop the ball on that. But I so much appreciate your time and for everyone showing up, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Schachtel. We now have time for Q&A. If you have a question, please make your way down to a microphone. Student questions will be given preference.
Hi, thank you so much. I think one of the questions I have is about compliance. They can't be successful if we don't comply. And I think we were all being groomed during this to see how much can they get from us? How far can they push us until we push back? And it feels like it was a grooming exercise, like the Event 201, where they were testing out models. And that's really what we lived through, was the model that they were doing. So the next thing on the radar, I feel, is this WHO pandemic treaty. And I'm just wondering if you can speak to that and the concern about that, because I think it's a really important thing for all of us to know about, because that's the next exercise and grooming and control.
What's interesting about treaties is that even though the government may decide to say that it's applicable, it still doesn't supersede the Constitution. So regardless of the United States having entered some treaty or ratified some type of agreement, I think that you can always at least, you can at least appeal to the to the framework, and if it's violated by, these international NGOs that are controlled by private powerful actors and states, then you shouldn't have to follow it regardless. And I think that some folks in Congress, like Thomas Massey, have taken a unique approach to that. And I think but you're right, especially, I don't know if this was an exercise to see how much they could get away with, but regardless of that, they got away with a lot, and it showed them that compliance was easy to compel, for sure. Thanks for your question.
Jordan, my name is Josiah Lippincott. I'm a student here, and I've appreciated your work over these last several years. You've done excellent reporting. My question for you is whether you think it's even possible to have government-funded science at the federal level. I mean, the Constitution doesn't really provide for that, and maybe what you're explaining here today is the reason why. But I just wonder if you could go into, is this a kind of problem that just the only solution is nuke it from orbit as a response?
No, I agree with you 100% that there's too many conflicts of interest when the government gets involved. Realistically speaking, I think that the best way to approach this is to combat the federal bureaucracy that continues to grow exponentially in Washington, D.C. I think that a lot of these presidential candidates will talk tough about, oh, I'm going to shut down, this department, that department. But the best, I don't know if they'll have the political capital to do that, but for sure, they should be able to do some damage to the unaccountable civil service in Washington, D.C., and that should hopefully help roll back the enormous funding and what they get away with. I think that's probably the best path forward, but I totally agree with you that science should not be directed by the government, and it just leads to horrible things.
Thank you, Jordan. You're amazing. I've been following your Substack for quite some time. Thank you for
Thanks,
what you
appreciate
write.
it.
And I love the fact that you write on a lot of different issues, and that gives a really big picture to everything. But my observation, and I was thinking about it as you spoke, public-private partnerships are really starting to look more and more like fascism, okay? And I think Thomas Sowell would say the same thing. But I want to drop something if you don't know about it. The NIST annual report, Cybersecurity of Genomic Data. Do you have that government report? It's part of the White House Cybersecurity Initiative right now. So I'll try to get that to you one way or the other. But think about it. What are PCR tests harvesting from everybody who takes one? Your genomic data. Okay, so it's just, I wanted to ask you about your thoughts about the fascism piece and also the fact that this beast is not going to stop. And I'm concerned how people get swept up with the extra arm of the media, propaganda arm that's controlling, as we heard last night, 2/3 of the population's thinking. And Mr. Kennedy said to us last night, we were the 1/3 that weren't controlled. But anyway, but thank you. Everybody follow his Substack. I'm serious. The dossier is amazing. And Substack's just a gold mine for all kinds of great information.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I'll send the check in the mail. But no, I totally agree that the the rhetoric of our government is not aligning with the ideology that they're pursuing, for sure. And you're right with this public-private stuff going on, and you have these extremely wealthy and influential power players on Wall Street that are dictating a lot of U.S. policy. And as a right-winger who's like pretty traditionally conservative, generally in the past you've wanted to take a hands-off approach to figuring out what the heck's going on with these private institutions that are accumulating enormous power. But now, as with the Pfizer example specifically, they're really starting to encroach upon our fundamental rights. So it's creating a huge problem. I mean, you can draw this line back to Obamacare or even further, where you have this fusion of corporate and public interests, and it's a huge problem in our country. But I think a lot of people are awakening to this reality, and hopefully this, I'm not so optimistic about Washington, D.C., but hopefully, on a more decentralized level, people will start to combat on those fronts and realize exactly what's going on, that you can't really just take a hands-off approach, and the problem isn't just big government. There's this whole other side that you were talking about.
Hi, Jordan. Your Substack is great. I want to encourage people to subscribe, because then you get 10 emails a day about subscribing to the paid subscription. But that's okay. It's still a great publication. I want to put you on the spot just a little bit, and if you could comment, it'd be great. If you can, I also understand. We were served up this sophistry of the bat crapping in the soup at the wet market for the longest time. And some people believed it. I mean, there are no bats there are no bats within 900 kilometers of Wuhan, China. Here's my question: do you believe in your heart that it could have been a lab accident, or was it done on purpose by the Chinese government or other people to kill human beings and to test out different power and control issues? And if you don't want to answer, I apologize for the question.
No, I'm happy to answer the question, and I appreciate the shout out for the Substack. But by the way, those emails are automated, the ones upselling. I don't do them. But the Chinese government, I'm no fan of the Chinese Communist Party history of ruthless anti-human behavior. The issue, of course, is the evidence trail slim to none for, I mean, objectively thinking about it, a lab leak makes more sense than someone ate a bat or a pangolin or whatever the latest one is. But I'm not comfortable declaring that it's an authoritative fact that either thing happened. But it makes the lab leak scenario makes more sense to me. The Chinese Communist Party has a history of genocide, so you can't really rule anything out. But I wouldn't I can't personally make an accusatory statement on this front, because while my instinct says, it could be lab leak or some type of purposeful thing to stir up the world's economy or combat the U.S. geopolitically, I can go down a lot of thought trails there, but I wish that people with a lot of power and influence could accumulate evidence so we can get those answers to the questions you have. And I hope that helps. Yeah.
Thank you. You packaged in a very nice package many things I've watched with horror over the last couple of years. I'll jump on your Substack. I'll look at the ads. I have a question, sort of a request, on the constitutionality of the WHO thing. The Epoch Times just recently ran an article that said, they might sneak that through because they wrote it to get around the Constitution, and the Supreme Court approved something similar a couple years ago. So would you please look into that and tell us what we need to do to stop it?
No, it definitely seems to be a very popular interest, the WHO treaty, and I'll do it. I'll definitely take that under consideration, start investigating it more, because I have definitely, you're not alone, I have seen the trend on social media that a lot more people, not outside of Washington, D.C. are talking about this issue, which, the people are more interesting outside of Washington, D.C. anyway, so for sure, we'll look into it. Thanks.
Hi, you mentioned moving on to the next crisis. Do you have any information on the question of whether people who've been jabbed with the mRNA vaccines should be allowed to donate blood?
Yeah, I don't want to speculate. So the problem with the mRNA issue is that there's actually so few people who fully understand the technology platform, and I certainly don't claim to be one of them. And one of the big problems we had during this era was that so many people with credentials next to their name made authoritative statements when they shouldn't have, when they should have had the humility to say, yeah, a lot of these folks are saying you should take it, but I haven't seen any evidence either way that you should or shouldn't take it. Or this notion that because you have an advanced degree and that you treat patients or that you work at a prestigious school as a professor, that you should be telling people what to do with their health decisions when they fundamentally did not understand this platform whatsoever. I mean, there's very few people. Robert Malone's one of them. And even if you ask Dr. Malone, there's still a lot of things he doesn't know about what's going on with these injections and the mRNA platform. So if he doesn't know, and the people who have worked on this, what are the chances that your local public health professor knows? I appreciate the question.
Hi. On Dr. Fauci, there was all the bio labs in Ukraine, and I think he was part of that, and the ones in Wuhan. Now, back in 2000 when Trump became president in 2017, he said there was going to be a pandemic. Fauci did. I don't know if you heard that, and I was just wondering if this wasn't just Fauci's doing. I mean, China wasn't upset about it. They just happened to be the people who had the COVID at the time when he released it.
Yeah, no, there's certainly, there's this meme going around that it shows the covers of Time magazine over the years. And every single year there's a catastrophic pandemic, there's a bird flu, there's another coming crisis. And these crises sell. And so far, none of them have lived up to the hype, which is interesting. But I think maybe your question was about potentially them causing a crisis. And again, like you've seen what these people have done over the past few years. They've treated human beings with absolute contempt for their rights. So the levels of their depravity remain unknown. But there are a lot of interesting foundational questions that I still have about this whole era that are for sure yet to be resolved.
Hi, thank you for your speech today. It was very enlightening. You mentioned a little bit about accountability. Unfortunately, not all of us can go into politics or medicine or law. How would you advise the common American to take steps to hold these people accountable for corruption in Big Pharma and the government?
Yeah, I think for me, the further you get away from DC specifically, and the more local you can get with your government, like even if that comes to influencing your school board somehow, or electing people to your school board that you can trust, I think that the DC question is a lot different than the local issue. I think there's a lot of progress that can be made locally. On DC, you just kind of have to blow up the administrative state. It's a very different solution. But yeah, I think you hold people accountable through decentralization in your town, in your city. Unfortunately, in Washington, D.C., it's just like a lost cause. Like, you're just going to hear these people. They're going to go on TV and say all these things and never really do anything. So I wouldn't get discouraged with them. But I would use my energies and capital, if you're going to get involved in these issues, to do so locally. Like, that's a reason why, I mean, in Florida, we had a situation where DeSantis was basically just like, I'm just going to overrule these like crazy school boards and whatnot. But there was a lot of effective political leadership outside of the state too, on a more local level. So I think like just basically don't get distracted with Washington, D.C. and do what you can to impact your local community.
So at the beginning of the year, thank you for your talk, by the way. At the beginning of the year, it looked like the narrative was starting to unravel, and we were starting to get more information come out and be public about what happened with COVID. And then Project Veritas let that video go with the Pfizer executive, and then all of a sudden it felt like radio silence. What happened to the slow exposure of this narrative? Because it seemed like other things just took over the narrative as soon as that video came out.
Yeah, so for sure, there's been a departure from the narrative, and that's why, like, I caution people to get behind the "we're all yelling at China now" narrative, and I don't know if that's. I think that it's. I have friends and acquaintances on both sides of the Project Veritas issue, and for me, it's just it's a really unfortunate series of events. Like, I'm not personally aware of any evidence on either side that this was some type of like Pfizer campaign to blow them up, but it certainly seems weird that happened after their most successful story ever. I don't know if the narrative shift is directly related to Pfizer. I wrote about this the other day that there's a whole situation with us giving, well, the American taxpayer giving over $100 billion to fight this war in Eastern Europe as a proxy, and China is very much getting involved on that front too, on the other side of the war. And I think that for me, like, that's why DC is suddenly going all in on this China thing. I think that they're kind of like threatened by these big movements that are happening with adversarial players. The Veritas thing, I think, is definitely significant, and I wish that they were operating and functioning, but it doesn't seem to be. I mean, I think that James O'Keefe will basically create another organization that will be just as good as Project Veritas. So I'm actually more optimistic that the same donors will just probably follow him, and they'll get some good investigative journalism up and running soon, hopefully once they get the legal situation figured out.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Yeah. I have a question. There was a lot of information available from the World Health Organization website and also the VAERS database, which has a public front end. You can go to it on any browser or on any computer and download all the data and analyze it yourself in Excel. And all of that data contradicted kind of the word that was coming out from Fauci and the government. So it was very easy to build an argument and then take it to your local school board and say, look at this. Do you know of any efforts that are underway right now to make that data no longer public or no longer available?
Well, I know that governments love to manipulate data. Like, as I referred to these studies, you have Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, was saying after his shots came out that they were 100% effective, which would meant that it served as a cure. And remember, you had all these people saying it was. So you can, the problem with, I think, relying on studies or statistics, especially when they come from these NGOs or government agencies, that they can be so easily manipulated. And with the VAERS database, it just kind of depends on the policy of the healthcare bureaucracy, whether or not they want to bother with it. So I think that this stuff can be helpful to make an argument, but it can also work as your worst enemy when someone pulls up the Harvard study or whatever, saying that my latest pharmaceutical drug is going to cure all the diseases in the world, based on these trials that we did with rats. So it's like you can lie with statistics and also tell the truth with statistics very easily, I think. But I appreciate the question. Thanks.
Please join me in thanking Mr. Schachtel.
Thank you.